I think culturally you have this impression of Leicester that it's going to be this really rich, culturally diverse city, but then when you actually go there, there's not that much sign of it in the centre of the city. It's all quite generic, small town. But then when you go further out into the suburbs, that's when it seems to become slightly more diverse. There's obviously the industrial heritage of red brick factories, which is still obvious, but then they've tried to smarten things up a bit with things like the Curve Theatre and the big Foreign Office Architects Shopping Centre, is that it? The John Lewis? But there's really nothing very special about it. Generally now, I think socially and politically it slightly suffers and gains from being so close to London. Like the train's so fast that it seems like many people commute, and there's a bit of an exodus out of Leicester, and it feels slightly forgotten. It might be like having some sort of autonomy as a region might be all that it needs for it to become less like everywhere else, or it could just all go horribly wrong and become an even more generic version of itself. If you don't think carefully about what the problems are that it has at the moment, even if powers are devolved, they're not going to be able to address them properly if they're not properly considered. Well, the clock tower is successful in that everyone knows it as a landmark, and it's a sort of a social meeting place, and it's a historic crossroads, and everyone kind of relates or sort of orientates themselves against it. And it's not particularly nice, but it's successful in terms of bringing people together and being somewhere you'd actually meet, rather than you can see that they've tried at certain places, like around new shopping centres, to create meeting spaces, but they don't seem to be used in that way. Probably the bit around the Ring Road, just because it's such a blot and it seems to cause so many problems in terms of living on either side of the Ring Road, and also there seems to be that seems to be the limits of where the council wants to go in currently anyway. They don't seem to be willing to go any further outside to address, because they want to bring more people into the centre, because these communities are fairly self-sufficient and there's out-of-town shopping centres, and I think if you address the issue of the Ring Road, the overriding issue of the city centre could be addressed also successfully. Chris's project, both addressing the new walk as an artery and a way of moving through the city, and it's interesting that his building is positioned right at the termination point of the walk, and mine is much further out, and it's interesting to compare how we've both taken advantage of that public path into the city. So my site is in the oldest part of Leicester, over the old Roman town. It sits adjacent to an existing public square where the cathedral, the Guildhall and council buildings all sit around this square. My site was originally a bus depot that's been pulled down, and I think it's interesting that in this most historic part of the city, where all these systems of power sit around this one square, my new proposal for a new regional assembly building sort of confronts all those different systems. Probably the large areas of like industrial warehouses in the centre of the city. You move very quickly from being in the middle of a crowded street, and then 5 seconds later you're in a back alley surrounded by empty warehouses, and you're right in the middle of the city, and it's such a waste. I guess the attitude to parking in general is rather flawed. All the city's overrun with car parks that are half empty, and no one's using the public transport network to get into the centre, because I guess it's too inconvenient when you can go out of town. It's probably the way people move around the city and the way they get in and out that's one of Leicester's biggest problems.